Thanks, Pam. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit how this is working in practice. So trying to get into a bit more kind of practical application. And this is the tool that I'm going to frame that around, which is our decision-making wheel, which is based on the Doughnut Economics model from Kate Raworth. So I'll kind of talk how we got to that and what's happened since. And I'll try and touch on a lot of the themes that came out there around trust and power and communication. So again, going back to the structure of the kind of the challenge. So this idea of you could change anything if you have a big enough lever and you stand in the right place. And so to kind of put this in the context of what we were trying to do. So for us, the earth is what we're trying to change within Cornwall Council is the dominance of linear short-term decision-making. This is what happens. This is what gets us into the problem in the first place. And this is what we need to move away from. How do we think about things as a system? So the kind of the fulcrum word we're pushing against or using to create this force is Cornwall Council has its mission and values. They're there, they're written down, and no one can kind of disagree with those. So if we can use them as leverage, then maybe there's something we can do there. And that actually just reminds me one thing that came up in our group that was quite relevant. This idea of how do you get distributed leadership into what council are doing? It's a very simplistic version of it, but effectively, if you can get the council to start talking about distributed leadership because it knows it sounds like it's a good thing, once that language is in there, then you can start pushing against it from within, and that's very much what we did within Cornwall Council. But anyway, I could talk more about that. And then the lever, the thing we're actually pulling is this idea of innovation is really exciting to decision makers, to local authorities, to councillors, and that can be really powerful. And also providing people a tool with which they can navigate the huge uncertainty and complexity that's just fallen in their laps with the declaration of a climate emergency, which they know they're supposed to do, but maybe don't know what on earth that means in practice. So actually in kind of understanding, yes, this is a huge thing that we need to shift, but we do have the tools, and if we use them in the right way, we might be able to implement some change. Effort is still effort. That's always going to be effort, and it is really hard. But we've got time, and this is what we need to be putting our effort into. So the context of this. So this is Cornwall Council's governance system, probably similar to many other councils. We've got full council, all of the elected members. We've got the cabinet within that, and then we've got the committees. So this is the fairly traditional the governance model we're operating in. So the context is, well, how do we fit that into this, and vice versa? And the short answer is, it's really difficult. They're just not built for each other, these systems. So there's going to have to be some kind of compromise there. So this is where we brought in the Doughnut Economics model, and this was influenced very much by the community within Cornwall who were already looking at this work. And recommending it, and people within Cornwall Council who've been reading about it. And very, very briefly, if you're not familiar with it, I'd recommend reading all about it. It's looking at how do we balance both the ecological ceiling and the things that we need to do in order to keep the planet functioning, and the social foundations, the things we need to make sure everybody has access to what they need. And the spoiler is we're not doing very well on either of those at the moment, but what we need to aim for is not going too far in either direction, but finding this sweet spot in the middle that acknowledges that it's a complex system of interrelated factors. And if we look too much at one of them or get kind of sucked in to focus in one specific area, we run the risk of everything else kind of falling apart. So what we wanted to do was bring that into cabinet level. So focus on that first and then change everything else later. So cabinet level, those are the decisions we want to change. That's where we decide how we're going to do the things that we've set out to do. So how our approach worked is we took the segments from the Doughnut Economics model, changed them slightly. So we've got the kind of our outer ring. These are the elements in that, and our inner ring on the right. These have since been adapted over time, but this is what we started with. And for each of these, ask a series of questions. So whichever officer is bringing a decision to cabinet will have to answer a series of questions on each of these areas. And here's an example of some of the questions. This is not exhaustive by any stretch, but what you'll notice is that these are yes or no questions. So they're quite simple to answer if you have the right information. And if you don't have the right information, then you are prompted to go away and find that information. Or it might not necessarily be relevant in that particular decision. So it takes time, but it doesn't have to be a hugely onerous bit of work, especially if you've done the groundwork in advance. The answers to these questions are then turned into a score from 1 to 5, which is applied to a color rating that is represented here, and then that then leads to this output, which is what is taken to cabinet decisions. So every decision there will have something like this. This is a kind of a nicely designed one. They don't look all this nice, but this is a sort of a case study that we use because it's a good example. So this is from an active travel program looking at installing cycling routes and walking paths. And the key things to note here is that there's a bunch of areas where we think this is going to have a positive impact, but crucially there are also areas where we're acknowledging that there is a short-term or limited negative impact. So the land conversion, biodiversity loss, potentially crime. And it's really, really important that we acknowledge and bring to the surface those negative impacts. And and if we get a wheel come to us and it's all green, or there's no yellow or no red, generally we will send that back and say, you probably haven't understood this well enough, because in a complex system, there is no perfect solution. There is very, very unlikely going to be a solution that has no negative side effects. It just means we don't have that data. We don't understand it well enough. And maybe that data is inaccessible and we just have to sort of sit with that uncertainty. But actually, if we do a bit more digging, maybe we'll understand, okay, no, there is a negative consequence, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't make this decision because it's better than doing nothing. And as long as we're aware of the negative impacts and we can mitigate those and we can understand those, then we can do something about it. And we can still move forward and not be kind of paralyzed by complexity. So that is a really, really important part of this tool. So how it's working, so as I mentioned, since 2019, all decisions at cabinet level going through this. We've been training colleagues, developing the tools for people to be able to use it, trialing it with procurement, changing the segment titles to make them clearer, and adding more as recommendations come in. So within cabinet, it's within the executive summary. It's pretty broad brush, so that decision makers can then drill into the key issues that come out of those. It's got kind of clear responsibility. The idea is it's done right at the start of whatever that decision might be, although that doesn't always happen, so that decision makers can kind of focus on the key issues. Here's another example of how else it can be used with sort of do we or don't we intervene in this decision? And you can see there's a sort of a clear indication that if there is an intervention in this planning decision, then the outcomes are likely to be much more positive than they would otherwise. Still with some negative implications, but look at the alternative, and it's clear where that decision should be taking us. This is a kind of a very simplistic, and it's not a very nuanced decision, so it's quite an easy one, but it obviously can be more nuanced than that. So the second version we're developing now is looking at developing with our existing decision-making tools, so incorporating other things around rurality and human rights, making it self-scoring, so it doesn't require quite as much investment from our team, so it's on a web platform, making it visually look nicer because people love the visuals. That's incredibly important. If you make it look nice, people will give it a lot more time than if it looks a little bit clunky. The oversight and insurance is improving, and it's going to be used much more broadly across Cornwall Council, so not just at cabinet level. But again, it's this kind of get it in small and then grow it from there, rather than try and bring in something that's already exactly what you want it to be. This is what version 2 is going to look like vaguely on the inside. So there's still a bunch of yes or no questions, but it's also asking for some more quantitative data around, how many or how much or something like that. And it's automatic. So whatever scores are entered in there, our answers automatically generate a score so that we don't have to have as much oversight over that. So the initial impacts of this, what's missing? It's not exhaustive. It doesn't cover everything. There are parts missing. So for example, it doesn't have gender equality in just yet. That's coming in. But if we're talking about public transport, we can't not talk about gender equality, because there's a lot of research suggests that women are more likely to take public transport. So if we don't have the infrastructure there, it's not just affecting carbon, it's also affecting many other social factors. So that needs to be developed. It doesn't measure anything. It doesn't tell you what would have happened or what will happen, and that can sometimes be hard for people to get their head around. The sections aren't differentiated between, so one might be a really, really important and relevant element to that, or the implication might be much bigger in one area than the other, but that has to be subjective currently, because the segments are all kind of the same size. It is highly subjective, and that changes over time, and the second version hopefully will be less so, but ultimately it's a tool. It's as good as those that use it and know better. But what's working, it is making a really complex issue accessible to decision makers in a nuanced way, and that is incredibly important. It's not perfect, but it's getting there. It does make sure that those negative impacts aren't ignored, or the evidence impacts aren't ignored. It improves that transparency. The appeal of innovation has been great. I mean, I do feel a bit uneasy about that, because it's not the motivation you want, it's not the driver you would choose, but it has meant that we've been able to go, look, this shiny thing, isn't it great? Aren't Cornwall great? When we know that the reality is there's a lot more that needs to be done, and this is not the finished article at all, but that does kind of grease the wheels sometimes. And fundamentally, it started real behavior change, which is a really difficult thing to do. So it's a first step. It's not finished, but it's a really important first step. And the point about transparency, I just want to just hold on that for a second, because it has been really important in making things transparent. So these two ideas are what's important and what's unknown. So in what's important, what we're finding, and what's not very surprising, is that economic growth is the default in a lot of decision making. That's not unique to Cornwall Council. That's not unique to local authorities. And we probably all got our own personal feelings about that. But what this tool is helping us to do is move from a kind of implicit, unconscious hierarchy to a more conscious system. And therefore, if we are making prioritizations, those prioritizations are conscious and not unconscious. If we're choosing economic growth over something else, at least we are transparent about that. And then from that, it can change. But if it's not transparent, then it's almost impossible that we're going to be able to shift that if we're not talking about it. And also about what's unknown. So the grey areas are either unknown impacts or no impacts, but we need to differentiate between them because they're very different. And think, okay, so if this is Cornwall Council's mission, or whatever organisation it might be, if these are your values, what do you need to understand to meet those? And if you don't understand them, how can you say that you are meeting them? So where are those evidence gaps? And again, it's not about blame. It's not about saying you have to know everything. But if you are ignorant about something, make it conscious rather than unconscious, because otherwise those things will be invisible, there'll be unintended consequences, and we'll make the same mistakes we've always made. Last couple of bits. One thing this has been really useful for is collaboration and co-creation and working with others. So we've set up a Cornwall Doughnut Collective, which is self-facilitated across local authority, across culture, across business, community, of organisations who want to develop their own version of their decision wheel, adapt Doughnut Economics for themselves. Some people who know way more about it than we do, and some people who are just coming to it now. And it's been fantastic because none of them have to look the same. There are so many different versions of the donut, and this is something I'm talking to a lot of other local authorities about. Of don't have to adapt our model. It's not the right one. It's not the perfect one. It works for us, yes, but actually, it doesn't matter. Every organisation is going to have their own governance, their own metrics. But if we're asking the same questions, then that really helps transparency and accountability. To come back to one of the questions before around, how do you engage with councils in a bottom-up way? One of the key barriers to that, I think, is accountability, in that councils feel like they've got loads of it and that the community doesn't have any of it. So if the community does something in collaboration with the council and it goes wrong, we've got all of that accountability, and that's a scary thing to hold. But if we can get some kind of transparency around, well, how are we making decisions? The council's making decisions in this way. We're asking the same questions that they're asking in community groups, that they're asking in businesses, the health sector, And yes, we're going through that process in a different way, and our donuts all look very different, but actually the prospect of asking the same questions is a really exciting one to make that more transparent. Very last thing, and this touches on something I was talking about earlier and in the working group. Don't worry about the words on here, it's not important. This is an example of a project I'm working on at the moment with the University of Exeter, which is looking at the climate adaptation impacts on health. So it's looking at getting really detailed data modeling for the likely change in climate in Cornwall, and what's going to happen as a result, what's going to be the implication on health. And the reason I share this is because now we've got the donut in there and we've got that decision making in place, we can then start building it from the inside. And so this is an opportunity to say, we don't understand adaptation as well as we should, but here's a way we can make our decision making more robust by bringing in a kind of a supplementary tool that supports that decision making that we would never have been able to just bring in on its own. But we can start doing that to build it up. So I think it's really important to start small, get the principle in place, and then make it what it needs to be, build it over time.